Sometimes in chess, you find yourself in a situation where every move ruins your position. During such moments, you wish that you could just skip or pass your turn, but in chess, you always have to make a move. When one side has to move, and all of the moves lead to a losing position, we call that position Zugzwang. In this position, whichever side has to move is in Zugzwang. With white to move, there are no moves for the king that can protect the g4 pawn, as f4 is covered by black's pawn. White is forced to give away the pawn after king e4, and king takes g4. When black should win the game, as long as black remembers the basics of king and pawn endgames. Looking at the starting position again, with black to move, black would be in Zugzwang for the same reason. Black cannot protect the pawn, and after the king moves, white simply captures the g5 pawn. Let's take a look at another example of Zugzwang. In this position, black's king is happy to sit in the corner and prevent white from making any progress. If black tries to force a passed pawn on the queen side with b5, notice that after white captures this pawn, white is only 3 squares away from promoting with check. Black's pawn, on the other hand, is 4 moves away from promoting. Black's plan is to just shuffle the king back and forth. Can you see a way white can put black into Zugzwang? If you found h7, great job. Black's king cannot move, but it is not stalemate because black does have a legal move, even if it is a very bad one. Black is forced to play b5, and after a takes b5, black loses the pawn race, and with it the game, after a4, b6, a3, b7, a2, b8 equals queen. Checkmate. Let's take a look at another example. Trying to win a rook versus bishop endgame can be very difficult if the defender's king is near the center of the board. In this position, white's king is stuck on the back rank, and after rook h1 check, white's only move to avoid checkmate is bishop c1. Using the idea of Zugzwang, can you find a checkmate in 2 for black? If you found any rook move on the first rank, great job. After rook g1, white's king is forced to move away from the bishop with king a1, when black delivers checkmate with rook takes c1. Let's finish this lesson by looking at perhaps the most famous Zugzwang position of all time. In this position, known as the Immortal Zugzwang game, Grandmaster Aaron Nimzowitsch has the black pieces against Grandmaster Friedrich Samisch. Black has a large space advantage, and all of black's pieces are far more active than white's army. Notice that white's queen is nearly trapped after rook 5 to f3. But after bishop takes f3 and rook takes f3, white's queen can escape with queen g5. Nimzowitsch wanted to avoid this, so he came up with a much stronger idea. Nimzowitsch played the very quiet but incredibly powerful move h6. After this quiet move, incredibly white is in Zugzwang. Black is now threatening rook 5 to f3, trapping white's queen. If white tries to make room for the queen to retreat, white's position will also collapse. For example, if white moves the dark squared bishop to the only safe square, c1, white's knight on b1 will be captured by the bishop. Notice that the knight on b1 and the bishop on g2 do not have any safe moves without being captured. If white moves the e1 rook, say to c1, the e2 square is no longer protected by that rook, so black can win white's queen with rook e2. If white moves the other rook to its only available square, f1, black will simply capture the rook with the bishop. Since any other move will lose white's queen after rook 5 to f3, Grandmaster Samisch resigned the game. Are you ready to run your opponent out of moves using Zugzwang? Let's see. Opposite colored bishops are as different as day and night. Opposite colored bishops always travel on the opposite color of the other bishop, so they never meet or attack one another. In endgames with only opposite colored bishops and pawns remaining, this means that one bishop can attack or defend squares that the other bishop can never protect. The opposite colored bishops increase the chances to draw and even set up surprising attacks. In this position, black has 3 connected pawns on the king side. With white to move, white can defend against all of these pawns with bishop to g2. White's bishop can sit on this diagonal, never allowing the pawns to advance without being immediately captured. White can draw easily, but should white settle for a draw? Although white can settle for a draw, white has a winning attack on the light squares. Do you notice that on the other side of the h1 to a8 diagonal, black's king is completely trapped in the corner and stuck on a light square? White can play the powerful move bishop to h3. And after g2, white can ignore the pawn and play bishop to d7. Since the attack is on the light squares, black's dark squared bishop cannot help defend the king. So after black promotes with g1 equals queen, white wins the game with bishop c6. Checkmate. Let's take a look at some more opposite colored bishop endgames. In this position, black is down 2 pawns, usually a very bad sign in an endgame. But thanks to the opposite colored bishops, black can draw after bishop to d2. After king to g6 and bishop to g5, black's bishop controls the c1 to h6 diagonal, and with the black king blockading the passed pawn on c6, black simply has to move the bishop back and forth on the c1 to h6 diagonal to draw the game. White's light-squared bishop cannot help attack the dark squares that black's pieces are using to defend the position. Let's take a look at another example. When a bishop only has to protect a single diagonal, the defender has good drawing chances. When the bishop has to try and protect 2 diagonals, as in this position, the defenses can often be overwhelmed. With white to move, white can win by playing h7, threatening to promote the pawn, so black has to accept the sacrifice with bishop takes h7. Now that black's bishop no longer helps support the king on the queen side, white rolls forward with c6 check. Black's position is now completely lost since king c8 is immediate checkmate, and any other move, such as king a8, cannot prevent white from promoting after b7 check, king a7, and b8 equals queen. White will deliver checkmate on the next move. Let's look at one more example together. In this position, white appears to be in serious trouble. Not only is white's rook hanging on g8, black is threatening to play f2 check and promote the pawn. White recognizes the chance to save the game by entering an opposite colored bishop endgame after playing the resourceful sacrifice rook takes g4. And after h takes g4, white is down 3 pawns, but draws easily after bishop f4. White's bishop prevents the g4 and h3 pawns from advancing, so that after king g6, white's king can block the f-pawn with king f2. And after king f5, bishop h2, white can simply move the bishop back and forth on the h2 to b8 diagonal, and black's pawns cannot advance. Are you ready to test your skills in opposite colored bishop endings? Let's see. King and pawn endgames are the building blocks that support your understanding of all other endgames. Once you understand these endgames, you will know when it is good to trade all of your pieces and enter the endgame, and when you must do your best to avoid it. The most important of these king and pawn endgames to first learn is the king and pawn versus king endgame. Knowing the rules of this endgame will bring you many victories and can also help you draw the game being a pawn down. How can we tell if a position is a win or a draw? The key is the idea of opposition. In this position, both kings are battling for the key squares c6, d6, and e6. White wants to move the king to one of these squares to help advance the pawn, and of course, black will do anything possible to prevent this. White could advance the king to f6, but then black would play king d6 and win white's pawn. After d6, Black must know exactly what to do in order to draw the game. When defending this position, remember to always keep your king directly in front of the pawn and to always stay on the same file as the pawn when retreating. The only move to draw the game for black is king d8. But let's see what happens if black plays any other king move. After king e8, king e6, and king d8, when the pawn advances to the 7th rank, the defender always wants the move to be with check. Notice that after d7, the black king is not in check and is forced off the promotion square after king c7. Now white plays king e7, protecting the promotion square and promoting the pawn on the next turn. If black tries to play king c8, king e6, and king d8, white advances the pawn to the 7th rank, once again, without check. Black's king is forced away from the promotion square after king c7, and king e7, black once again loses. The only move that saves the game for black is moving straight back and staying on the same file as the passed pawn with king d8. After king e6, black gains the opposition with king e8. If white moves the king away, black will immediately move the king in front of the passed pawn and move back and forth on the same file as the pawn. After d7 check, the pawn advances to the 7th rank with check, which means that black's king can move in front of the pawn and block it with king d8. If white moves the king away from the pawn, black simply captures it. So after king d6, the position is a stalemate. Let's take a look at another example. In this position, white has only one winning move. In order to win this king and pawn endgame, you want your king to be in front of the passed pawn. White takes the opposition with king e5. White has the opposition because the kings directly oppose each other with one square between them, and it is not white's turn. Since black has to move, white is going to gain one of the key squares, d6, e6, or f6. If black plays king d7, white's king will advance to f6. If black plays king e8, white will play king e6. And if black plays king f7, black's king has given up protection of d6, so white takes over that square with king d6. If black now plays king f6, black now has the horizontal opposition, as there is an odd number of squares between the two kings, and it is not black to move. Although black now has opposition, it doesn't stop white from simply marching the pawn up the board with e5 check. If black's king doesn't move to f7 right away, white will simply march the pawn up the board. And after king f7, white takes over opposition with king d7. White's king now protects the 3 squares the pawn will use on the path to promoting into a queen, so black loses this endgame. Instead of king f6, black could have tried to control the promotion square by playing king e8. White now wins by gaining opposition once again with king e6. And after king d8, black's king gives up control of f7, so white takes it with king f7. After king d7, white's pawn marches up the board with e5. And after king d8, e6, king c7, e7. As we have seen, gaining opposition allows the attacker to take over critical squares to promote the pawn, and opposition for the defender usually prevents the attacker from making any progress. There are some cases when gaining direct opposition does not work. Let's take a look. In this position, white is threatening to take opposition with king d6. Although black can gain opposition with king d7, black is still losing. It doesn't matter which side has opposition if the side with the pawn has a square to advance. After d4, white takes over the opposition and will win the endgame with proper technique. Here is another position where opposition does not save the defender. After king d8, even though the defender has opposition, if the side with the pawn can get the king on any of the 3 squares in front of the pawn on the 6th rank, in this case c6, d6, or e6, The side with the pawn will win no matter which side has opposition. This is because white can force the black king off the promotion square at the right moment. After king e6 and king e8, white advances the pawn with d6. And after king d8, notice white is able to advance the pawn to the 7th rank without check after d7. This means black's king is forced off the promotion square. After king c7 and king e7, white will win the game. Let's take a look at one last example. When the side with the pawn is left with a rook pawn, opposition does not help. Once the defender's king is able to control the promotion square, the game is drawn, as the king will simply move back and forth and never leave the corner of the board. After king a6, white has direct opposition, but notice that after king b8, opposition did not give the king a key square to use to move forward and escort the pawn, which is the point of opposition. After king b6, king a8, a6, king b8, a7 check, king a8, king a6, black draws the game with stalemate. Direct opposition can be a tricky idea to learn, but once you understand it, you'll be winning or drawing games without a second thought. Now it's your turn to practice direct opposition. When opening a chess game, knights and bishops usually jump right into action. The rooks often have to wait, limited to helping pawns advance up the board, waiting for their chance to enter the game. Sometimes, rooks only find their full strength in later middle game and end game positions, when more pieces get traded off, clearing space for the rooks to move across the board. Rooks are very powerful pieces in the endgame, and knowing their strengths and limitations can be the difference between winning or losing a chess game. Let's explore the powers of the rook in the endgame. In this position, the rook is battling white's passed pawn, which is only 3 squares away from promoting. A single pawn is usually no match for the powerful rook, but since black's king is completely out of the action, white's king and pawn working together can be a serious challenge for the rook. With white to move, it is very important to keep the king and pawn connected to fight against the rook together. So white plays king f4, moving the king up the board to help escort the pawn to the promotion square. Black's rook has a few choices, but the game should be a draw with accurate play from white. If black tries to cut off the king by playing rook to c5, white's pawn marches forward with g6. And if black tries to attack the pawn with rook to c6, if white rushes forward with g7, black's rook has separated the king and the passed pawn and now wins easily after rook g6, winning the pawn on the next turn. After rook c6, instead of pushing the pawn too far away from the king, white should keep the pawn and king together by playing king f5. White is now ready to play g7, when black's rook will have to sacrifice itself for the advanced pawn. If black tries to bring the king into the game with king b2, after g7, black's rook is forced to the back rank with rook c8. White's king marches up the board with king f6, and after king c3, king f7, black will have to sacrifice the rook for the passed pawn on the next turn, or draw the game with a perpetual check after rook c7 check, king f8, rook c8 check, king f7. Let's see if black had another way to try and win this endgame. Black can also try rook f1 check, and after king e5, black separates the king from the pawn, but the rook cannot both keep the king cut off from the pawn and prevent white's pawn from promoting. White draws the game by marching the king and pawn up the board, rank by rank, until black's rook will have to sacrifice itself for the pawn. If black tries to bring the king into the action with king b2, both sides continue with their plans after g6, king c3, and g7. Black's rook is now forced to prevent the pawn from promoting with rook g1, allowing white to connect the king and pawn with king f6. If black's king were in front of the pawn, this position would be easily winning for black. Since black's king is so far out of the action, white draws after king d4 and king f7. White is threatening to promote the pawn on the next turn, and black will need to sacrifice the rook. Let's take a look at this position again, except this time it will be black to move. We saw with white to move, the teamwork of the king and pawn was enough to draw against black's powerful rook and out-of-place king. With black to move, is the position still drawn? Can you see how black can cut off the white king from the passed pawn? That's right, by playing rook to c4. White's king can no longer help advance the pawn up the board. White loses quickly after g6. Now that the pawn cannot be protected by the king on the next turn, black wins the game with rook c6, threatening the pawn, and after g7, black collects the pawn with rook g6. White's best chance is to stay close to the pawn and wait with king g3. Since black's rook prevents the king from defending the pawn, and advancing the pawn loses for white, black can play the slow but effective plan of bringing the king into the game and attacking white's defenseless pawn. After the moves king b2, king f3, king b3, king g3, king b4, and king h3, black plays king c5. If white continues to move the king, black will simply move the king over to white's pawn and capture it. As black's king blocks the rook from moving up the board, white races to promote the pawn with g6. Black's king moves closer to the pawn and opens up the rook's path to the back rank with king d6. White is only one move away from promoting after g7, but black's rook catches the pawn in time with rook c8. And after king g4, black collects the pawn with rook g8. Let's take a look at another example together. In this position, black's pawn on a3 is under attack. If black advances with a2, white wins the pawn by forking the pawn and king with rook a3 check. What should black do? It's important to remember that rooks belong behind passed pawns, not in front of them. Let's see what happens if black puts the rook in front of the pawn with rook a1. After king g3 and a2, black is threatening to play rook g1 check and promote the pawn on the next turn. White plays the important rook a3 check, placing the rook behind black's passed pawn. After black's king moves to safety with king b6, white needs to deal with black's threat of rook g1, checking the king and clearing the promotion square for the pawn. One idea is to play king f2. Although this move prevents any checks on the first rank, it turns out white has made a serious blunder. After rook h1, black is threatening to promote the pawn. The only way to prevent this threat is to play rook takes a2. White captures the pawn, but now the king and rook are lined up on the same rank, so black wins the rook with the skewer rook h2 check, capturing white's rook on the next turn. After king b6, white should play king g2, controlling the h1 square and preventing black's rook h1 trick. After king b5, king h2, white can safely move the king between h2 and g2 until black attacks white's rook with king b4. Since white's rook is behind the passed pawn, it can move all the way down the board with rook a8. The rook still puts pressure on black's pawn, and after king b3, once the king protects the pawn, threatening to move the rook off the promotion square, white simply checks the king with rook b8 check. If black tries to protect the pawn, white's rook will continue to check the king. If the king moves away from the pawn, such as with king c3, white simply returns to attacking the pawn with rook a8. Black cannot make progress, and the game is drawn. Since moving the rook in front of the passed pawn did not work out for black, a much better idea is to put the rook behind the passed pawn, starting with rook d4 check, gaining a tempo against the king to place the rook behind the pawn. After king g3, rook a4, Black is ready to advance the pawn, so white quickly blocks the promotion square after rook c1, a2, rook a1. As we saw in previous examples, an active king is very important. Both sides rush to bring the kings to the action after king b6, king f3, king b5, king e3, king b4, king d2, and king b3. Black is ready to play king b2 and force the rook to move, but white's king prevents this with king c1. Has white saved the game? Not if black forces the king away from the critical b2 square with rook c4 check. After king d2 and king b2, black forces the rook to move and will promote the pawn on the next turn. Can you make the most of the rook in the endgame? Let's see.